Old man, what are you doing here? The flight line isn't a place you just wander into. Ethan Cole barked, his voice sharper than the heat shimmering off the runway. Right in front of him, the F-16 Viper 09 lay motionless, an inert block of steel. It was supposed to take off in just a few minutes, yet 3 hours of effort had yielded nothing. The pressure from command weighed on Ethan's shoulders like stacked concrete. Henry Walker stood a few steps away. He didn't respond. Not a flinch. Not a glance at Ethan. His eyes traveled along the spine of the aircraft as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Ethan clenched his jaw and stepped closer. I told you this area is restricted. You're not clear-headed enough to be standing here. He grabbed Henry's thin but steady arm and yanked it as if asserting dominance in front of the young technicians gathering behind him. A ripple of laughter broke out. Maybe he thinks it's a museum piece, or he believes the plane will wake up if he just touches it. The jeers mixed with the wind, sharp-cutting, and so disrespectful, it made the air itself feel tighter. Henry still said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on the old leather pouch in his hand, the only thing he carried as a wall of mockery spread across the runway. And that very silence pressed down on the space around him, strange and unexplainable, as if the atmosphere recognized something the young men did not. Ethan jerked Henry's arm again. All right, that's it. I'm calling security. You need to leave now. But Henry kept his gaze fixed on Viper 09. No resistance, no fear, just the quiet tightening of an old leather pouch, and in that instant, though, no one understood why the entire flight line seemed to hold its breath. If you believe true courage doesn't lie in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have lived through war, then subscribe to Service Honor Stories and help us preserve the memories, the dignity, and the honor of our quiet heroes. Henry did not respond to Ethan's shout. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, and didn't try to step away. His silence wasn't born of fear or submission. It was as if he had stepped into his own fold of time, a place where the noise and impatience of youth could no longer reach him. His left hand rested gently on the body of the F-16 Viper 09. Just a light touch, yet there was something strange, like someone meeting an old friend after many long years apart. The cold metal seemed to soften for a brief instant, as if the aircraft were being recognized, understood, comforted, in a way no words could ever express. Ethan hesitated for half a second at that gesture, then tried to mask his confusion with a frown. I told you to leave this area, he said, his voice quieter than before, though even he didn't know why. Henry still didn't answer. His hand remained on the aircraft's frame, his eyes following the seam lines, the bolts, the junctions of metal details anyone could see, but very few could truly understand. There was something in Henry's gaze that looked almost like longing. The flight line, usually so loud, the whipping wind, the generators, the movement of personnel, the crackling radios seemed to lose its sound the moment Henry touched the aircraft. No one ordered silence. No one attempted to create it. Yet the entire stretch of runway became thick-heavy, as if time itself had slowed down to make room for the quiet reverence radiating from the old man. When he shifted his arm slightly, the worn leather pouch he carried slid a bit, revealing the aged tools inside. Each piece bore the marks of time-smoothed wooden handles, darkened metal screwdriver tips, slightly bent from hundreds of uses in conditions few people alive could imagine. Anyone observant enough would know these weren't collectibles. They were fragments of a real life of a man who had spent his youth among jet engines, scorching oil, and sleepless nights, wondering if the machine before him would bring someone home alive. A breeze passed. Henry closed his eyes, letting memory rise to the surface like a thin wave. In a blink, he was no longer standing on the present-day runway. He was back in a distant decade where battlefield mist and clashing metal still felt painfully fresh. He saw himself younger, standing beside a prototype fighter the team was trying to perfect under suffocating pressure. He remembered the sleepless nights spent ensuring a single bolt sat exactly where it belonged. He remembered the footsteps of his teammates, their laughter, their arguments, their silence in the face of loss. The memory rose, then dissolved like foam. Henry opened his eyes, returning to the present. Viper 09 before him was no different from the machines he had touched decades ago, still carrying the spirit of those who had poured sweat and blood into turning the jet into an icon. Behind him, the group of young technicians slowly fell quiet. They didn't understand why no one felt like laughing anymore. There was something in Henry's presence that made it impossible to mock him further. Ethan tried to maintain his hardened expression, but his hand tightened around the radio more than usual. He felt the old man's silence digging into him, making him question whether what he clung to was authority or just the fear of being seen as insignificant. Henry withdrew his hand from the aircraft gently, like setting an old memory back onto a stone altar. He bent down to pick up his leather pouch, tightening his grip, as if it held not only tools, but also stories he had never shared with anyone. And just when the silence seemed to be fading, a burst of laughter rose again from the group of technicians, sharp enough to drag the moment back into the tension that was waiting to ignite. Ethan bent down, picked up the tool with its faded wooden handle from Henry's leather pouch, and held it up for everyone to see. "You really think you can fix an F-16 with this outdated junk? This is scrap metal, you understand that?" The words came out colder than sun-heated steel. A group of technicians behind him burst into laughter, the kind of mocking laughter youth often use when standing in the shadow of authority. They mistake for real strength. Another added, "Maybe he thinks this fighter jet runs on old-school spirit." Henry said nothing. He didn't snatch the tool back, didn't show any sign of irritation. He simply looked at it the way someone might look at a keepsake being mishandled. His eyes didn't react and didn't show hurt. They remained still quiet in the way of someone who had witnessed enough to know that noise never reveals the truth. Ethan stepped forward, his tone sharper. "I told you to stay away from the aircraft. This isn't a place for you to wander. Let people who actually know what they're doing handle it." He grabbed Henry's arm and pulled hard. The old man stumbled half a beat, not because he was weak, but because Ethan's pull was too sudden. The leather pouch slipped from Henry's hand, landing near the landing gear. A corner of the pouch opened, exposing tools that had followed Henry through countless years, darkened stains, worn edges, scraped metal marks left by thousands of touches on aircraft skins, on burning metal, on responsibilities no one else ever saw. A laugh shot out from behind. "Ancient relics." Another followed, "Who even uses this stuff anymore?" But Henry only bent down and quietly gathered each item. Not rushed, not trembling. His fingers brushed the frayed seam of the pouch, as if putting back together pieces of private memories someone had just trampled over. Ethan crossed his arms, his voice filled with triumph. "Did you hear me? This bird is worth more than your entire life." Several louder laughs followed. No one objected. No one stood beside the old man. No one thought anything was wrong. Henry rose to his feet. He looked at Viper Zolar 9. One slow, deep breath. His eyes were not on Ethan, nor on the crowd mocking him. They were on the aircraft, as if offering an old, quiet greeting that only those who had poured their hearts into this craft could understand. Henry's stillness pressed on the air in a strange way. The laughter continued, but it lost its bite. A young technician stared at Henry a moment longer. He didn't know why, but in that brief instant, he felt as though he were witnessing something larger than himself, larger than this petty confrontation. But Ethan didn't stop. He grabbed Henry's arm again and pulled him away from the landing gear. The leather pouch swung violently, and a tool fell out, rolling across the ground. With a sharp, dry clatter, a sound that sliced through the chaos like a clean cut. Henry bent down to pick it up. No one noticed the flicker in his eyes, whether it was memory fatigue or a silent farewell to a time long past. But one thing was clear: he remained silent. A silence so steady that it unsettled others, not obedient, not frightened, just resolute. The crowd laughed again, but this time the laughter wasn't as confident. It thinned, grew uncertain, like people trying to cover something they didn't yet dare to name. Ethan turned toward the group and said loudly enough for Henry to hear, "I'm calling security. They'll get him out of here immediately." No one objected. No one intervened. Everyone stood there believing they were witnessing an ordinary scene on an ordinary workday, except for the man holding the old leather pouch, and the one person in the group who had just sensed that something about all of this was profoundly not ordinary. And it was that brief moment of confusion, small but sharp as a fracture, that opened the path for a change no one saw coming. While the technician's laughter still lingered on the runway, Master Sergeant Luis Ramirez stopped what he was doing from a distance. He hadn't heard the entire argument, but something else caught the eye of a man who had spent more than 30 years on the flight line Henry Walker's posture. Henry wasn't standing like an old man who had wandered into a restricted area by accident. He stood like someone who knew exactly where he was. Like someone who had stood in that very place many years, many generations before. His shoulders angled slightly toward the aircraft, one foot set near the curve of the landing gear, and his eyes that made Ramirez hold his breath, moved from the wing root to the edge of a technical panel beneath the fuselage, stopping precisely at the spot Ramirez and his team had suspected all morning, but couldn't solve. Ramirez looked at Henry again more closely this time. Most people looked at an aircraft the way outsiders look at a complicated machine. But Henry, he looked at the F-16 the way someone reads a familiar story. The way he observed could not be faked, could not be imitated. Ramirez had seen that stance before. A very long time ago. A memory surfaced nights during his early training days when he was still a young airman. The older team chiefs used to tell stories about flight line legends, engineers, and mechanics who needed only one glance to know what an aircraft needed, what it lacked, where it was broken. Those names slowly turned into folklore because few in the newer generation ever reached that level again. And now, when Henry gently placed his hand on the old leather pouch, Ramirez felt a chill run down his spine. Not from fear, from realizing that something sacred was being disrespected, something no one else could see. Ramirez moved a little closer, not interfering, but close enough to read the expression in Henry's eyes. When the old man tilted his head slightly, his brows tightened in a subtle motion, one only someone in the trade would understand. It was the frown of a man reconnecting a long, sleeping chain of knowledge, as if he were silently speaking to the aircraft. What happened to you? Ethan didn't see it. Neither did the young technicians. They saw only an out-of-place old man, an outdated leather pouch, an inconvenience in the middle of a stressful workday. But Ramirez saw what youth often overlooks, the stillness that comes from true experience. He stepped back and touched the radio on his belt. A fleeting decision, but heavy as steel. He pressed the button and kept his voice low. "Maintenance Command, this is Master Sergeant Ramirez." A familiar tone replied on the other end. "Go ahead, Ramirez." Ramirez glanced at Henry one last time before speaking. "I need to confirm something. Do we have in our historical records an engineer named Henry Walker?" A silence followed longer than usual. Not the silence of a bad connection, but the silence of someone who had just heard a name they never expected to encounter again on the flight line. The voice dropped. "Say that name again." Ramirez's grip tightened. "Henry Walker." Another pause. Longer. Heavier. Then finally a single line came through like a signal that something enormous had just shifted. "Understood. Hold your position. Do not let anyone touch him." Ramirez switched off the radio. He looked toward the group of young technicians where Ethan was still raising his voice, and suddenly they all seemed strangely small compared to the old man standing there quietly with his leather pouch in hand. Ramirez didn't speak. He simply stood there knowing a tidal wave was coming, and no one around him realized they were already standing at its center. And when the distant rumble of engines began to roll across the air, hinting at an arrival, no one had prepared for the runway. Itself seemed to change the rhythm of its breathing. Not long after Ramirez's call, a strange, heavy sound began to echo from the far end of the runway. No one noticed it at first, until the command convoy bearing the base insignia appeared speeding straight toward the maintenance area without slowing down. Rows of technicians froze immediately, military instinct locking their bodies upright, as if they had just received an invisible command. Ethan lowered his radio, his face draining of color. He had never seen a high-ranking convoy enter the flight line during work hours like this. No one spoke. No one dared to guess what was coming. The door of the lead vehicle flew open. A colonel stepped out, Colonel David Harrington, base commander. He didn't look at Viper 09, didn't ask for a report, didn't look at Ethan. His eyes fixed straight on Henry Walker, who stood silently with the old leather pouch in his hand. Ethan jolted as if ripped from a dream. "Sir." Colonel I. Harrington didn't answer, not even a glance. He simply continued walking forward, heading directly toward Henry. Every step he took seemed to compress the air around him. The younger technicians straightened instinctively, still confused, but sensing the warning spreading through the atmosphere. Harrington stopped just an arm's length from Henry. His voice was low, but heavy enough that every person heard it clearly. "Airman Cole," he said, without taking his eyes off Henry, "let go of him. Now!" Ethan released Henry instantly, as if he had grabbed burning metal. No one laughed anymore. No one dared even breathe too loudly. Harrington lifted his hand to his cap, straightened his posture, and executed a formal salute one the young technicians had never seen him give to anyone except star-ranking officers. A precise salute. A rigid salute. A salute reserved for someone he deeply respected, Mr. Walker Harrington said, his voice steady, but catching slightly at the end, "It is an honor for this entire base to welcome you back." A shock rippled through the younger airmen like an electric current. Ramirez tightened his fist behind them. Ethan stood frozen, his face chalk white. Henry remained still. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Harrington. Not with pride, but with the eyes of someone accustomed to being forgotten. Harrington turned to face the entire flight line, silent now, unmoving. "All of you," he said, enunciating each word, "are standing before Henry Walker." He let the silence stretch long enough for the name to sink into every person present. The man who served as a lead engineer in the early development of the F-16 prototype. The man who wrote foundational chapters of the maintenance manuals you rely on every single day. The man to whom we owe far more than most of you even realize. No one moved. The wind swept across the runway, yet it felt as though the very air had been compressed. Harrington continued. When an entire squadron of F-16s was grounded in a combat zone decades ago, the person called in wasn't a general, it was him. Mr. Walker asked for nothing, accepted no commendation. He simply did the work so that the pilots could come home alive. Those words shifted the atmosphere instantly. Eyes that once mocked now looked away in shame. Ethan bowed his head shoulders tight as the truth crashed over him. He hadn't grabbed the arm of some confused old man. He had grabbed the arm of someone who helped create the very aircraft they stood around. Harrington turned back, placing a hand over his chest in gratitude. Mr. Walker, you laid the first stones for the technology we depend on today. Henry said nothing, offering only the faintest nod, the nod of someone who had survived wars, yet kept his humility intact. And in that moment, the entire flight line understood that the silence of this old man carried a weight no young rank could ever touch. As Harrington stepped back to make room for the deeper truth that was about to unfold, the runway seemed to hold its breath for the second time that day. When the name Henry Walker was spoken by Colonel Harrington himself, the atmosphere on the flight line changed completely. There were no whispers, no laughter. Only the heavy weight of a truth that very few people were ever fortunate enough to hear directly. Harrington looked straight at the young technicians. "Let me make this clear to all of you," he said, each word firm as a nail. "Mr. Walker isn't just an engineer. He's one of the first test pilots of the early F-16 program." A sharp exhale came from someone in the group. No one could tell whether it was from shock or regret. Harrington continued. In those early days when the F-16 existed only as drawings on a design table, Mr. Walker was the one who first took it into the sky. The initial roll shakes the uncontrollable vibrations, the incorrect calibration ratios. He recorded and corrected all of them himself. He pointed to the underside of the aircraft where Henry had placed his hand earlier. He is the one who wrote the foundational chapters of the maintenance procedures you rely on every day. The instructions you treat as common knowledge are the work of the man standing before you. Henry remained still, his expression unchanged. But in his deep-set eyes, a faint layer of memory flickered, brief as a passing breeze, yet clear enough for Ramirez to realize he was remembering the days long gone. Harrington drew a deep breath and spoke the sentence that seemed to freeze the entire flight line. Mr. Walker once flew into an active combat zone where an entire squadron of F-16s was grounded due to system failures. They were waiting, and he alone brought them all back into the sky in less than 2 days. Ethan felt his throat close. The hand that had pulled Henry moments earlier now felt ice cold. He stepped back just slightly, but in the silence that step sounded like a crack splitting open. Harrington continued, his voice dropping, but filled with reverence. Mr. Walker never accepted a medal, never accepted a title, never signed a single award recommendation. He simply returned home as an ordinary man and let most of his achievements disappear into classified records. A young technician lowered his head, then a second, then a third. Shame moved through the ranks of youth like a wave no one could escape. Henry stayed silent. His hand tightened slightly around the leather pouch, as if touching old comrades, those who had walked with him through chapters of history that never made it into books. Ethan tried to open his mouth, but no apology would come out. He only stood there, his back stiff eyes fixed on his boots like a rookie just shaken awake from the arrogance he once mistook for ability. Ramirez stepped closer to Henry, not to assist him, but to show respect. "Mr. Walker," he said softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "We did not recognize." Henry looked at him, his gaze calm. No blame, no desire to revisit the offense. Simply the look of someone who had witnessed far more than one lifetime could ever fully recount. Harrington turned back to the entire team. "I want all of you to understand, Mr. Walker is not a legend told casually over a meal. He's a man who has saved the lives of countless pilots. And today he stood right here before us, treated like someone who had lost his way." No one spoke. Henry exhaled softly, a breath that sounded like it came loose from many years of silence. And though he said nothing, his presence carried more force than any argument could. A strange feeling spread across the flight line, respect without being commanded. Ethan looked up, eyes red, as if waiting for the smallest sign that he could bow his head and apologize. But Henry did not look at him with resentment. His gaze carried only understanding that youth sometimes fails to recognize true worth. And just as the air was sinking into that heavy quiet, Henry shifted his hand a small motion, yet it felt like the beginning of something everyone needed to hear. After the truth about Henry Walker was spoken for the entire flight line, Colonel Harrington turned back toward Ethan. His eyes were so cold and heavy that anyone who met them would instinctively straighten their posture. "Airman Cole," he said, his voice hard as steel, "you disrespected a man you are not worthy of comparing yourself to. The uniform on your shoulders does not permit such behavior." Ethan lowered his head, his throat dry. He didn't dare look up, didn't dare justify himself. But before Harrington could continue, Henry stepped forward half a step and gently placed his calloused hand on the colonel's arm. "That's enough, Colonel," he said, his voice not loud but clear to everyone. "He's just a young man still learning, and I'm used to being misunderstood." Harrington looked at Henry, surprised by such generosity. "But sir, Henry shook his head. "We fix aircraft, Colonel. We don't fix people with anger." Then he turned toward Ethan. His eyes held no blame, no pity, only a calmness like a lake that has witnessed many storms. "You know, Henry said machines don't care about rank or ego. They only respond to the truth." Ethan looked up, his eyes red like someone watching their own mistakes under full light. "Sir, I'm sorry." Henry gave a faint smile. "No one is born right from the beginning. What matters is whether you're willing to learn." He knelt beside Viper 09, his finger stopping exactly at the spot the entire team had missed. "The problem isn't in the complex system," he said. "It's just a small valve that's stuck." He opened the leather pouch, pulled out a tool worn by time, and handed it to Ethan. "You do it." Ethan blinked, stunned. I don't dare." "Go on," Henry replied. "Because only when you fix it yourself will you understand the lesson you need to remember." Ethan knelt beside him, his hands trembling, but his eyes suddenly bright. He placed the tool exactly where Henry indicated. A gentle tap. A small, sharp click echoed. And then Viper 09 stirred. Lights flickered awake along the cockpit. A tone rose like a long sigh after a deep sleep. Ethan backed away, eyes wide. I really did it." Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do it alone. You did it because you were willing to listen." Harrington bowed his head to Henry, and the young technicians behind them followed, not because of rank, but because they had just witnessed the greatness of a man who chose respect over retaliation. Henry looked over the entire team, his eyes gentle but sharp as a reminder. "You are more talented than we ever were. But remember, this skill opens the door. Dignity keeps it from ever closing." A solemn silence spread outward, warm as a breath touching everyone present. And in that very moment, when the quiet settled over the runway like a soft mantle, a new chapter of the morning began to take shape quietly, but powerfully, like the heartbeat of those who truly understand the value of legacy. When Viper's mind roared back to life under Ethan's trembling but determined hands, the entire flight line fell silent. No cheering, no applause. The silence wasn't from surprise. It was because they all knew they had just witnessed a moment that would be retold for years to come. The glow from the cockpit displays reflected across Ethan's and Henry's faces like a quiet affirmation. The aircraft had come back to life, and so had the self-respect of a young man. Just 1 hour after the incident, an order from the command office was issued. The base would open a new training program dedicated to the history and legacy of the F-16. The first lesson wouldn't be technical specifications or system diagrams. It would be the story of the people who turned this fighter jet into an icon, including Henry Walker. Ethan was informed he would attend a 3-week retraining course, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to be awakened in Colonel Harrington's own words. Ethan accepted without a single complaint. He understood this was the path he needed to walk to become a real craftsman, not just a young airman in a blue uniform. Weeks passed. The sun on the runway no longer burned as harshly as that day. Ethan walked into the base library after class carrying an armful of new technical manuals. When he stepped into the aviation history section, he unexpectedly saw Henry Walker sitting comfortably in an old fabric chair, as if it were a familiar seat in his own home. A thick book lay open in front of him, turned to the chapter on the early F-16 prototypes. Ethan paused for a few seconds, then approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." Henry looked up, his eyes still gentle and bright as ever. "You're here to study more, Yes. I think I'm missing more than I realized." Henry smiled. Everyone begins from a place of lacking. Neither of them mentioned the incident that day. No mention of the laughter, the rashness, nor the moment the aircraft came alive again. They simply talked about engine generations, vibration tests, and the pilots who had flown with Henry in the early years of his youth. A conversation between two generations, one who had walked through fire, and one learning how to step through the fire of his own pride to grow. When Ethan stood to leave, Henry gently pushed his old leather pouch aside to reach the page again. The pouch sat there beside Ethan's stack of technical manuals. 2 worlds old and new, close enough that their boundaries disappeared. Ethan glanced at the pouch, then at Henry. "You still keep it?" Henry nodded. "It carries lessons no book ever writes down." Ethan didn't respond, but his eyes softened as if he had come to understand that some things are never measured in years, only in the marks they leave on the hearts of those who witness them. He left the library with a silence as light as wind. Henry watched him go, saying nothing. Yet in his eyes lingered a rare peace, the peace of someone who has passed on what needed to be passed on. And the leather pouch remained there beside the thick book, a final symbol of a legacy not written in ink, but carried through respect by those who know how to bow their heads before a simple truth. Honor is never loud, and kindness never retires. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes.